Welcome to Live Oak Unitarian Universalist Congregation. I'm Drew Carter, and I'm a member of the worship ministry. The Reverend Tamara Casanova-Suzuki is not in the pulpit this week, but she'll be back next week. We are very happy to welcome Lora Barnett, who is our ministerial student intern this year here at Live Oak, and she is going to lead us in worship this morning. Thank you. This congregation is one of respect and inclusion. We accept all people as they are, growing towards who they might become. And we believe that our becoming happens better in a community. And we welcome all of those who hunger for a spiritual home of acceptance and love.
Good morning. I am thrilled to be with you this morning. It is good to be in community. Our call to worship this morning comes from my favorite poet, Mary Oliver. It's called When Death Comes. When death comes like a hungry bear in autumn, when death comes and takes all the bright coins from his purse to buy me and snaps the purse shut, when death comes like the measles pox, or when death comes like an iceberg between shoulder blades, I want to step through the door full of curiosity, wondering, what is it going to be like, that cottage of darkness? And therefore, I look upon everything as a brotherhood and a sisterhood. And I look upon time as no more than an idea, and I consider eternity as another possibility. And I think of each life as a flower, as common as a field daisy and as singular, and each name a comfortable music in the mouth, tending as all music does toward silence. And each body a line of courage and something precious to the earth. When it's over, I want to say, all my life, I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom, taking the world into my arms. When it's over, I don't want to wonder if I have made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to have ended up simply visiting this world. Let us worship. I'm going to invite us now to come into a time of silent meditation. So I invite you to just sit both your feet on the ground and breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth, or however you wish, because you don't have to comply. I will send you off into meditation with a Celtic morning prayer, and it goes like this. Bless this day, all that I might see, all that I might hear, all that I might smell, all that I might say. Bless this day, all that I might serve, all that I might comfort, all that I might help, all that I might guide. Bless this day. Let us now enter into a time of silence. So I haven't had a chance to get to know all of you yet, but I know that I will over this next year. So I thought I'd start my first sermon with you by letting you know that I am a storyteller by nature. And the way I preach is through story every single time. So maybe I'll learn some other styles under Reverend Tamara. It is often said in ministerial circles that a preacher has but one sermon that she gives over and over in different forms during her entire life. And the stories shared and the theological emphasis or the poetry of the sermon might shift or change. as she herself changes, but the essential message generally remains about the same. And as I have moved through these past 4 years of formal ministerial training, I have to say that this stereotype is actually fairly true of me. Despite the fact that I keep picking different poetry and different theological emphasis, my essential message is the same. My essential sermon is a call to seeing. It's a call to hearing, to listening, to observing, to humbling, and to letting down of the barriers that block our authentic connection with one another. My essential invitation is always the same. Stop and look. Slow down. Observe. Walk the path of vulnerability with courage, integrity, and joy. And always, always, always be yourself. I preach, of course, what I need most to learn and to practice. So with that, let me tell you my first story for you. So as some of you know, last winter and spring, I worked as a hospital chaplain at Cottage Hospital. And this is a required part of training for the ministry. I went into that experience expecting to be changed and shifted, but primarily I thought, I'm just marking one more box along the way of this very long journey in the process of formation. What I found was that this program was one of the most intense phases of my ministerial formation to date. The daily exposure to illness, to loss, addiction, hope, love, and death was sometimes more than I could handle. My third week at the hospital, I attended 6 deaths in 7 days. It was heartrending work. The most painful was the day I spent companioning a family that had lost one of their 8-month-old twins to accidental suffocation at home. It was a very unusual case. The mother of the infant was a patient in the hospital for a condition unrelated to the birth of her twins, and her child had passed overnight at home while she was away. And we got a call that the family was on their way to the hospital to inform the mother of the passing of her infant. There are no words for this kind of grief. The loss of a child is one of the worst kinds of pain that a human can feel. We spent the whole day with that family as they moved through their initial shock and grief to some sort of initial acceptance of the reality of what they were walking through and the permanent shift in the structure of their family. I discovered in those moments that the only thing that I could offer to this family was my compassionate presence, my willingness to see them as they truly are, without expectation that they should be anything else than who they were in that moment, and to accept that there was nothing I could do to make it better, because I had no power to do so. All I could do was show up and be present. And in that moment, I discovered that to be present and to be compassionate is to come fully alive, even in the midst of grief. Friedrich Buechner writes that the place where God calls you is the place where your deep gladness and the world's hunger meet. Looking back, I think that this is the day that I found a new part of my calling, a calling to be ever more present and not look away, even when it is hard, and maybe especially when it is hard. And in this act of seeing and holding and companioning, I found that deep joy. All of it was holy, and all of it was blessing. One of the things I needed the most in the midst of this process was a theological grounding that could support my new learning in the hospital setting. Funnily enough, and just in time, my seminary offered a class on Celtic spirituality. I was excited to learn more, since my exposure to Celtic ideas as a native California girl raised on the outskirts of Berkeley was rather limited to some vague ideas involving earth-centered ritual, Enya, maybe wearing some ribbons in my hair. I mean, I really was so clueless. And my ignorance is not all that surprising, considering the long suppression of Celtic ideas and the way in which American culture packages these complex theologies for ready consumption and sale. So I entered this class full of curiosity, ready to learn, and hungry for new grounding. And I'll admit that I am already one whose theological orientation inclines towards theism. I was raised in a Christian community, and even after I left the church of my childhood, I maintained a personal connection to the God of my understanding and prayer as a regular practice. So entering this class was not too much of a theological stretch for me once I got my head clear on the topics that were involved. I discovered in the Celtic Christian spirituality class, because that part wasn't in the description, Celtic Christian spirituality, not just Celtic spirituality, I discovered in this tradition a strand of Christianity that resonated with me as a Unitarian Universalist Christian and gave me new ways to respond to the questions of my heart. And you did hear me correctly say that. I do identify as a Unitarian Universalist Christian. And I want to claim this in front of you this first Sunday because I share Reverend Tamara's belief that it is important, even essential, that ministers own their own theologies openly and fully. She and I agree that this is important because we can only be present for you and your journeys if we are fully present for our own. So consider it a permission slip to just be yourself, and we'll get along just fine this coming year. Now, I discovered in my work as a chaplain that everywhere, everyone is hungry to be seen, and that the act of seeing one another, really seeing them, is as healing as any medicine. I discovered in my Celtic Christianity class a theology and a methodology that is dedicated to seeing. To see is to bless. The Celtic Christian tradition arose from the unique interplay between the Druidic, earth-based religious culture of the British Isles and the Roman soldiers that first encountered these tribal peoples. After the fall of the Roman Empire, though, the Celtic world had no contact with Rome for nearly 200 years. The result of this isolation from Rome was a Christian theology that celebrates the whole of creation as good and calls humans to be a blessing upon the earth. From the beginning, the Celtic tradition aligned itself with social justice, welcomed women as leaders, and celebrated the body and sexuality as holy. Most of us in this room are probably much more familiar with the Roman mission, the one that aligned itself with the Roman Empire in the early 300s. And through church fathers like Augustine, gave us doctrines of original sin and redemption through salvation in the one and only begotten Son, Jesus the Christ. Today, this is known as traditional Christianity, or orthodoxy, right understanding. But orthodoxy did not spring out of a vacuum. It was a long and hard and bloody fight for supremacy. When speaking of early Christianity, it would be actually much more accurate to speak of Christianities rather than Christianity. The one version that did win out is the one called the Roman mission, and that's what scholars refer to it as. And many of us in this room are troubled by the way in which this particular strand of theology has been used to diminish the inherent worth and dignity of Native peoples around the world. It has resulted in genocide many, many times, here in this country and for the Celts. So if you're troubled by that emphasis on conversion and orthodoxy, know that it's okay and even appropriate to be troubled. It means that you are actually seeing. Stay there. And now I invite you to notice that perhaps you're imagining what might have happened if the Celtic Christian tradition had become the dominant theology of Christianity. Notice how easy it is to get attached to that fantasy. And hear me say this. I am not here to offer Celtic Christianity as a solution to what ails you and this world. And I am not here to denigrate one tradition in favor of another. To do so is to miss the point entirely of looking closely in the first place. We are called as Unitarian Universalists to wrestle with the messiness of human life and to work out our own answers. I do hope to spark your imagination about what might have happened if those two traditions, those two strands, and the other strands that were suppressed had been allowed to flourish and grow and be side by side the whole time. We might have a different world. Not necessarily better, but different. I want to dive in a little bit deeper, though, into what this Celtic tradition does offer us. As I mentioned, the Celtic tradition calls us to perceive the whole of creation with all of our senses and to celebrate its essential goodness. This tradition takes as its primary theological source the creation stories of Genesis from the Hebrew Bible. However, its interpretation of these stories is far more conservative than traditional Christianity. It is, in fact, more in agreement with Jewish interpretations. Celtic Christianity, for example, rejects the doctrine of original sin. The fall story is a meditation on suffering, not a condemnation of human sinfulness. And the Celtic Christians understand sin more as missing the mark, actions that take us out of alignment with our inherent goodness, rather than as a reflection of an inherently sinful nature. It's a small but very significant shift in orientation. The Celts understood instead that the human being is part of God's creation, and since God blessed the creation as good, then human beings are good. This goodness is held between a twin set of blessings, nature and grace. This first one, nature, is the original blessing, the blessing of being born into a human body, into this beautiful creation, where food grows abundantly and the sun rises and sets every day. At its center, we are held as humans with a divine spark, and we are called forth to be a blessing upon the world. That blessing is given freely to every human being and every earthling that walks the earth. The second blessing is that of grace, which is an invitation to return to our natural state of goodness anytime we miss the mark. In between nature and grace is the messiness of human life. The suffering, the trauma, the joy, the excitement, the celebration, the curiosity, the learning, and the missteps that we daily encounter as embodied human beings in a vast and complex universe. The good news for the Celtic Christians is simply that there is nothing you could ever do that could essentially separate you from your goodness or from the love of the Creator. That no matter how far you stray, you are always free to return to your natural state of goodness. For Celtics, the life of Jesus was the focus, not his death. Redemption was always available, and abundantly so. This does not mean that the path back is always easy. Celtic Christianity is rooted in reality, rooted in seeing the consequences and the outcomes of the suffering that we cause to ourselves and to one another. And it warns us that as far as we go into the messiness of human life, when we wish to walk back towards grace, we must also deal with that messiness on the other side. It is a loud, messy, and chaotic grace that is worked out in real time and in real relationship. It's a radical claim to love beyond belief, which should sound familiar to us from our universalist side of our heritage as Unitarian Universalists. The French Celtic mystic Teilhard de Chardin wrote, "To understand the world, knowledge is not enough. You must see it, touch it, live in its presence, and drink the vital heat of existence at the very heart of reality." Teilhard de Chardin wrote many of his most insightful essays while serving as a soldier in World War I. He was no stranger to the depths of human suffering and depravity. He saw it all, and he did not turn away. Rather, he looked ever more deeply, trusting that the solution to what ails us is available in the looking. He insisted that love always wins. And this stand came from his commitment to seeing the world as it is, not better or worse, just as it is, and then from there choosing the good. It's a deeply compelling stance. This past spring, I practiced standing in that space. And in doing so, I learned that the act of seeing ourselves and one another requires that we go slowly. And I mean this quite literally. I started walking, talking, breathing, and moving more slowly this spring. And when I did so, something miraculous started to happen. I began to see others differently, as maybe a little bit more holy and a little bit more blessed. And so I invite you to consider what might happen for you if you allowed yourself to slow down and go a little bit more slowly this week, just to see what else could you see? Who else might you become when you slow down and look deeply into your own heart and that of another? Let us see what happens. Amen. Blessed be. Please remain standing for our benediction, and if you are comfortable, you may join hands. If you prefer not to join hands, just simply place your hand over your heart so that your neighbor can honor your request. Our faith, this congregation, is dedicated to the proposition that behind all our differences, beneath all our diversity, there is a unity that makes us one and binds us together forever, in spite of time and death and the space between the stars. We pause in silent witness to that unity. And I'll leave you with a Celtic blessing. May the longtime sun shine upon you, all love surround you, and the pure light within you guide your way home. So be it. Amen, and blessed be. And now, as we extinguish, I forgot about this part, I always do. And as we extinguish our communal chalice, our service truly begins.